Tonight's lecture concerns itself with 18th century Berlin. Perhaps out of all of the lectures, it's the most focused and the one that has the greatest influence on the Jewish people. In my opinion, it's also the one that has the most pathos to it and also has tragedy that is just unmistakable, especially in the light of what happened to German Jewry, what happened to the Jews in Europe because of Germany. In the 18th century, in the 1700s, the Jews in Germany suffer persecution far worse than they do in Eastern Europe. The Jews are not allowed to live in cities. They are restricted to ghettos. They find themselves in a very, very low position without really having any opportunity for improvement. And in this milieu, Germany is not a united nation. There's Prussia on the east, where Berlin is located. And Berlin then is not the major city that it would be later. It's a garrison town for the Prussian army. The Prussian Emperor Frederick William has 25,000 troops garrisoned in Berlin, far more than the rest of the population. There are about 200 Jews that live in Berlin, and to live in Berlin you had to have permission, and you had to pay a special tax. And in order to enter the city, even if you were a merchant or a peddler or someone passing through, every Jew had to pay an additional customs tax in order to be able to come into the city. So it's not a hospitable place for Jews. In fact, in Germany, with the exception of Hamburg, which really was part of the Danish Empire, the tri-city of Altona, Hamburg, Wandsbek, Ahu, except for that city, the Jews in Germany were in terrible condition. Frankfurt, Jews were crammed into the ghetto. Jews had to get off the sidewalk if a German approached. There was absolutely no tolerance of Jews. And in fact, if we look for the antecedents of what happened later in Germany, I think we find it in the conditions of the Jews in the 17th, 18th century, before the Jews assimilated. And as we will see, as the Jews assimilated, the Germans resented them more and more. The more like the Germans the Jews became, the more the Germans despised them. And in perfect hindsight, we could say that this was all a wasted effort, but this is perfect hindsight. Now, much of the lecture that I'm giving tonight is based on a book by Amos Alon called The Pity of It All, the story of the Jews in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's a wonderful book if you have a chance to get it and read it. The only drawback that I find in the book is that he doesn't get it either. Everything that he writes is absolutely fabulous, interesting, factual, enormously well researched, but he comes to no conclusion. And without the conclusion, then to a certain extent the entire effort is wasted. So let us begin on our journey. He makes a point that is excellent, and the point is that every revolutionary movement in the Jewish world that dominated the 19th, 20th century until our time had its origins in Germany in the 18th century. Secularism, Zionism in the 19th century, Herzl, by Germany I'm including Austria, the German-speaking country, the belief in culture, the rejection of religion, even psychoanalysis. These are all utopian ideas. German Jewry was convinced that somehow this was a rational world that we lived in, that it could be improved, that it made sense, and that that was the basis for all progress. All of the movements, Marxism, even Zionism, etc., all were based on a rational basis. It was a scientific, proven theory that had reason to it. The fact that none of them turned out, well, that doesn't usually bother the true believer. But all of that is based in 18th century Germany. Now, what happened in 18th century Germany is that the Enlightenment came to Germany. The Enlightenment, which began in England and spread to France, came to Germany. And the Enlightenment basically was the religion of reason. 18th century Germany produces Goethe, it produces Kant, it produces Lessing, it produces Nicolai, it produces these people who are all reasonable men and who hold that reason, intelligence, education will bring the better world. In German, there's a word called Bildung, which means education and culture. It means being sophisticated. And that became the religion of the Jews of Germany. The religion was Bildung. And that has continued to a great extent. That's the religion in the United States, and most American Jews send their child to university, to professional school. It's not seen as a means to an end, it's an end in itself. And that was the idea of the Enlightenment in Germany. Kant said that, and Kant was also no lover of Jews. In fact, in his school in Prussia, he admitted, by the end of the 18th century, he admitted 2 or 3 or 4 Jews to attend, but none could graduate unless they converted. And he described the Talmud as this outdated Gothic structure. And Kant said that the Enlightenment came to free mankind from its self-inflicted immaturity. And the immaturity had to do with religion, with faith, with belief in the supernatural, with anything that Kant did not deem to be reasonable. And therefore, this spirit of the Enlightenment swept Germany. But it didn't sweep the masses of the Germans, who absolutely had no connection with it. But the intellectual level, the few people on top, the thin crust of academia, they were greatly impressed by these ideas of the Enlightenment, and they were the ones that pushed them forward. Jews could not enter the guilds in Germany. The rule was, I quote, that the guilds excluded Jews, murderers, manslaughters, blasphemers, thieves, and adulterers. I don't know who was left to enter the guilds, but Jews were singled out that they could not be in the guilds. If you couldn't be in the guilds, you couldn't be an artisan. So Jews were reduced to being peddlers. They were reduced to being beggars. And you have a phenomenon in the 18th century. It's a throwback to medieval times. In medieval times, there were people, today we call them homeless. People that wander the streets. in the Middle Ages, thousands wandered. They walked from town to town aimlessly. And most of the time they survived by begging and by stealing. And this phenomenon was well known in Europe. They were the ones that helped spread the plague, because they went from place to place and they contaminated the new places they came to. By the 17th century, this phenomena had almost disappeared in Europe. But in the 18th century, it reappears. And it reappears regarding Jews, especially in Germany. And there's a Jewish underworld, a crime world in Germany in the 18th century. So much so that Yiddish and Jewish words became the words of the underworld. To steal in the underworld was to ganve. And this cauldron of Jews, most of them refugees from Eastern Europe, wandered over the face of Germany, again begging, and when they couldn't get their way by begging, then by thievery and other forms of crime. And therefore, in the eyes of the German people, who do not like disorder, who do not like things to be out of the rules, so to speak. So this Jewish penchant, so to speak, for begging and for wandering and for being criminals naturally reflected itself in the fact that the entire Jewish community was tarred by it. All of this begins to change with one man, and that man is Moses Mendelssohn. In 1730, Mendelssohn knocks at the gates of Berlin, and he has a special letter to allow him entry into Berlin. The rabbi of Berlin was Rabbi David Frankel, a well-known Talmud Chacham, a well-known Talmudic scholar. And Mendelssohn himself was a Talmudic genius. He was an Ilui. And because of his reputation as being this great young scholar, he's 15 when he comes, Frankel agrees that he will take him under his wing and study with him, because that was the method then. There were no yeshivot. You went to great rabbis and studied with the rabbis if the rabbis would have you. And the rabbis were usually very rigorous and strict in who they took. And so Mendelssohn pays the tax, and he comes into Berlin, and he studies with Frankel. He studies with him for 6 years till he's 21. And that time, Frankel grants him rabbinic ordination, smicha. Not only that, Frankel predicts that this will be one of the great luminaries of the Torah world, that he will be a rabbi that will be able to effectively raise the level of study, etc. What Frankel did not know was that during the 6 years that he taught him Talmud, and that he became such a great Talmudist, at night Mendelssohn taught himself Latin, Greek, English, German. He read philosophy books. Now, any of these things were punishable. There was a Jewish warden, Jewish police force in Berlin that was run by the rabbinate. There's nothing more dangerous than giving the rabbis power. And if they caught you with a book, they threw you out of Berlin. You weren't allowed to live there anymore. And many young men were so driven out of Berlin because of the fact that they had a German book in their hands. Mendelssohn lived a charmed life. He was never caught, and he educated himself. And not only that, he made friends with the one and only Jewish doctor in Berlin, because Jews weren't allowed in medical school either. But this man was an exception, who taught him Latin. And then he studied mathematics, and then he studied astronomy. So you have here a person who is literally a Renaissance man, who knows everything, and who is a pious Jew. Mendelssohn was an observant Jew till his death. He never missed a mincha. And he has all of this education, and he comes into this world of the Enlightenment. And Mendelssohn therefore looks about and he sees the Jewish community. And the Jewish community in Germany is, as I described, it's persecuted, it's poverty-ridden, it has a moral squad police force that anything that is done that you don't like, you can throw the person out. There's no appeal to any higher authorities for justice. And there are court Jews, especially to the Prussian emperor, 3 or 4 families who run his businesses. The emperor always needs money. Government always needs money, in case you have any doubt about it. You look at our government. So there is always an attempt somehow to raise more money. And the court Jews were the experts at raising more money, which again did not make the Jews popular. They invented new taxes. They ran the banking system. They got loans and credit. And more than that, they were able, through their contacts, because Jews know Jews know Jews know Jews, they were able to bring the emperor the jewelry that he needed to keep his women happy. They were able to bring him the silks and the clothing, the spices, the foods, all the luxuries that absolute monarchs crave, but that they rarely have the money to pay for. So these 4 or 5 Jewish families were enormously wealthy when everybody else was broke. And they built for themselves, there was one mansion in Berlin that was a square city block. And that was the court Jew that built it for himself and his family. In all of this, you can see the seeds of the problems that are coming. The problems could have come anyway without any of this, but we don't know that. We can't play what if. We can only say what was. The universities did not admit Jews. Mendelssohn looks around at the Jewish community, and he, really in an attempt to save, as he sees the Jewish community, he says that somehow we have to attach ourselves to the Enlightenment. When the Enlightenment will settle in over Germany, it'll bring tolerance, it'll bring freedom of religion, it'll bring reason, it'll bring Bildung. And when that happens, then the Jewish problem will be solved. Now, Mendelssohn makes friends with non-Jews because of his reputation. He was always called the Jew Mendelssohn. He himself is almost a grotesque figure. He's a hunchback, he's short, he has the typical Jewish nose. He is portrayed literally as the caricature of what later all the anti-Semitic pamphlets painted Jews as looking like. That's what he looked like. The noble Mendelssohn. In fact, the Prussian emperor, when he finally meets him, he avoids meeting him for decades. And when he finally meets him, he repeats what the Talmud says, that the Roman said to one of the Tanoim, who also was not exactly handsome and was physically deformed. He said, "Never can I understand why God would put such a great mind in such an ugly vessel." Mendelssohn has no means of support, so he goes to work as a bookkeeper. First he takes a job as a tutor to a family called Berthold. And Berthold takes Mendelssohn to be the tutor in Talmud to his son. Berthold was already a fairly wealthy person, and Mendelssohn has a protected status which allows him to live in Berlin, because otherwise you're not allowed to live there. And he teaches Berthold's son not only Talmud, he teaches him German, and he teaches him, because the Jews didn't speak German, the Jews spoke a Jewish German, a Yiddish German, a jargon. He teaches him High German, and he teaches him mathematics, and he teaches him secular studies, and Berthold is very impressed thereby. But after a period of time, Mendelssohn tires of being a teacher. Today they call that burnout. And he becomes a bookkeeper for a Jewish silk merchant. And he meets a woman that he falls in love with, and they marry. He marries rather late in life, well in his 30s. And he has no visible means of support except this menial job of being a bookkeeper. But while he's a bookkeeper, his genius mind is at work. And he has these non-Jewish friends. His two main non-Jewish friends were Gottfried Lessing, who is the leading German playwright of the 18th century, and who is ranked in literature with Goethe and Schiller and Heine. Top person. And a publisher by the name of Nikolai. And these three form a society, an intellectual society. Mendelssohn remains observant. He tells Nikolai, "I can't meet you on Saturdays." And once in the middle of an important meeting on Friday, he says to them, "Gentlemen," he said, "as far as I'm concerned, the meeting is over. I am going into my room to welcome the Queen's Sabbath. You may continue without me." And they knew not to serve him food. Mendelssohn remains the Jew, but he is in this rarefied company of the enlightened, of the people who saw reason as being the salvation of European culture. They saw it as the salvation against war, because they said reasonable people don't make war. They saw it as the salvation against poverty, because reasonable people will figure out an economy that people will be able to live by. Reason was going to save everything. Now, Mendelssohn read a book that Nikolai had published by a French philosopher, in which the philosopher explained many things about about immortality, etc. And Mendelssohn said, "Well, that's not much of a book." He said, "I could do better." To which point Nikolai said to him, "Then why don't you?" and Mendelssohn began his career of writing philosophy. His main work of philosophy was a book called Phaidon, which dealt with the immortality of the soul based upon the ideas of reason, proving by reason, by logic, that mankind must be immortal. Human beings are immortal. There's a soul afterwards that remains. And believe it or not, this book, which in current culture would probably sell 4 copies, became a bestseller in Germany. A bestseller to the extent that Mendelssohn's financial woes disappeared. And Nikolai's the one that published it, and he's the one that distributed it, and it made Mendelssohn's reputation. He wrote 4 other philosophical works, one right after the other, all the time staying as a bookkeeper. You know the old bad joke about the Jew that says that he was a bar mitzvah teacher. And he said that if he were Rothschild, he would be richer than Rothschild because he still would teach bar mitzvah. So Mendelssohn is an example of that. He still remains the bookkeeper. And he writes these books, and they gain attention not just in Germany, but throughout Europe. And Mendelssohn is called the German Socrates. And his reputation is so great that even the Prussian Emperor Frederick William, who was a rabid anti-Semite, hated Jews. He forced, in 1847, he forced out of the 260 Jewish families in Berlin, he picked what he called 120 best that they could remain, and the other 140 were forced to leave. And when they left, he said, "Thank God we got rid of them." Mendelssohn is nominated a number of times by professors, by philosophers, to be a member of the academic society, to receive honors. The emperor vetoes Mendelssohn's application every time. But he's forced at the end to meet with him because of a certain reason. So they send a letter, a summons, to the noted Jew, Herr Mendelssohn, the noted Jew, Herr Mendelssohn, to come and appear at Sanssouci at the palace of the Prussian emperor. The anecdote that's told is that when he approached the gate and the guard said, "You're seeing a Jew come," he said, "What do you want here?" So he showed him the summons from the emperor. So he said, "Noted Jew, what makes you so special that the emperor would want to see you?" And Mendelssohn coolly replied, "I'm a famous sorcerer. I do magic." And the guard was so frightened he let him in. So that's the world that he's operating in. He's operating in this world of Lessing. Now Lessing writes a play, one of the most famous plays, called Nathan the Wise, which is a defense of tolerance, a defense of reason. And the hero of the play is the Jew Nathan, which is a thinly disguised Mendelssohn. The play was banned in Vienna and in Paris, in other places in Europe, but it was performed in Berlin, and it made a great stir. And Mendelssohn becomes the symbol of Jewish emancipation, of the fact that Jews should somehow be tolerated in Germany, something which the Prussian emperor is not willing to do and which the masses are not willing to do. Now, 2 other things happen here with Mendelssohn that both are worthy of comment. First of all, there is a Christian pastor by the name of Lavater Lavater is a Swiss missionary clergyman who is convinced, he's really a madman, as we'll see, but the world many times is influenced and governed by madmen. And he is convinced that the second coming of Jesus is at hand, and the only thing that's holding it back is that the Jews have not yet converted. And therefore he sets out on a one-man crusade to bring about the conversion of Jews to Christianity. And who is more likely a candidate than the great Jew Mendelssohn? And because if Mendelssohn will convert, so then every reasonable Jew will convert as well. There was a book written by a Frenchman by the name of Bonnet, also the book based upon the fact that Jews should convert, and Bonnet attempts to prove through logic why Christianity is the more logical religion. Lavater sends Mendelssohn, he translated Bonnet's book from the French to the German, and he sends Mendelssohn a letter, but it's a public letter, published in the newspapers. And he said, either refute Bonnet or do the honorable thing and convert immediately. That's the challenge. Well, Mendelssohn, again, is not emotional about any of these things. Mendelssohn answers him that if it's a question of logic and reason, Judaism is a far more logical and rational and reasonable religion than is Christianity. He said, in Christianity, you have to believe that somehow God came in the form of a human being, something which we have never seen before or since, and we have no precedent for such an idea. You have to believe that God allows himself to be killed, also something that never happens before. You have to believe in the resurrection. You have to believe in all of these things. He said, what kind of logic, what kind of reason is that? He said, Judaism, he said, may be burdened with ritual, but it is rich in reason. And his answer was accepted, not only accepted, it was broadcast by all the people of the Enlightenment, all of whom practically were lapsed Christians, and who saw in the answer the justification for their own desertion of religion, for their own desertion of Christianity. And Lavater is so taken aback by the answer that he sends Mendelssohn an apology for having issued the challenge. But Lavater had another crazy thing, which later on came to be real. All sorts of quack ideas exist in the 18th and 19th centuries, just as they do in our time. He had the idea of physiognomy, meaning that if you look at a person's face, if you measure the person's nose, ears, etc., you can tell everything about the person. And that therefore people of genius, they have a certain nose and they have a certain cheekbones, and you can recognize people that way, and this was built into an entire science. And because he was a very, very famous publicist, and he was a clergyman, and he had a following, hundreds of thousands of people came to believe in this. Later on, the Nazis used it. The Nazis used it to prove whether you were Aryan or not. They had people look at you, they could tell whether you're Aryan or not Aryan. And to make up for his challenge to Mendelssohn, he wrote that Mendelssohn's face shows genius. Mendelssohn's face shows an enlightened character, a noble person. And therefore, pictures of Mendelssohn were spread throughout Germany. In non-Jewish homes, there were pictures of Mendelssohn because that was like the perfect face. Even though, by objective standards, I mean, Hollywood would not consider it to be the perfect face. But again, he becomes this celebrity. Second incident regarding Mendelssohn is the fact that he wants to, I don't want to use the word reform because Mendelssohn is not the father of Reform Judaism. His disciples, Friedlander, and then later Geiger, they are the ones that founded Reform Judaism. Mendelssohn never had that in mind. But Mendelssohn did have in mind that Judaism, the Jews at least, had to sign on to Bildung, had to be cultured, had to know more than just Talmud, had to somehow have a broader vision. And in so doing, he writes this great translation and commentary to the Bible called the Beur. And it was completed by, again, a Talmud of his, Wessel. And this Beur, which was in German and then translated back into Hebrew, became the basis for modern scholarship, quote unquote, in the Bible. It's a monumental work, but it was excluded from almost all Orthodox homes. I remember in Chicago that there was one copy of the Beur that we in the yeshiva knew existed, and it only existed in the house of a certain Chassidish Rebbe in Chicago. And, you know, that was the underground rebellion. If you wanted to see it, you know, so you made an appointment with the Rebbe and he'd let you look at it for 10 minutes. But nobody would have the Beur. It became, because of what happened to Mendelssohn and his family, it became anathema. It became excluded. But that wasn't Mendelssohn's purpose. And it's interesting, part of his purpose, in fact, the major thing in his purpose was not so much the translation from Hebrew into German. It was the fact that the Jews would learn German by reading the Beur. That was his idea, his goal. And this would be the way, because the Jews knew the Chumash. So now if they read it in German and they were able to see the translation of the German, they would learn German. And that would bring them into this idea of Bildung and of culture. Mendelssohn had 6 children, he and his wife. 4 of them would convert to Christianity. None of his grandchildren would be Jewish, because what happened now after Mendelssohn's fame, so then 2 opposite things happened. One thing happened in the non-Jewish world. The non-Jewish world said, you know, all the Jews must be like Mendelssohn. They're all geniuses. They all must be exceptional. So let's use them. And then they discovered that there weren't that many Mendelssohns around. That the Jews were like everyone else. That not everybody knew Latin and Greek and mathematics and astronomy. Not everybody was interested in knowing it. And therefore, they created in their mind what they called the non-Jewish Jew. That's who they wanted. They wanted the non-Jewish Jew, which was represented by Mendelssohn, by his intellect, by everything that he stood for. That was their goal. And Goethe writes how disappointed he was because he took in a number of Jews to study under him, etc., and they turned out to be average, mediocre. If he would have gone to our yeshiva, he would know that everyone was superior. All right, because we have no one that's average. But in the real world, the average people are average. It's a bell curve always. And he's disappointed, Goethe, because he thought everybody's going to be Mendelssohn. And the non-Jewish world began to expect that. began to expect that they would have the non-Jewish Jew. And when they didn't have it, so then they felt that they were cheated by being tolerant to the Jews. The reason that we were going to let the Jews into society, the reason that we were going to remove the barriers, the reason that they were going to be allowed to come in was because of the fact that they were so exceptional. And now we let them in and we find out they're not so exceptional. There are a few that are, and most of them aren't. So then why do we let them in? What benefit is there to German society from it? So that's one thing that operates in a strange, strange way. There's a second thing that operates in a strange way, and that is the Jews, again, this upper crust, maybe 70 Jewish families, create what are called salons, which in the French were discussion groups, literary groups, etc. The Jews ran the salons in Berlin. And these became, as you can imagine, hotbeds of revolt, rebellion, new ideas, progressive ideas, ideas that were off the wall. The government didn't like it. It threatened the foundations of the society and the rule of the dictator. And the salons eventually led to the fact that Jews were willing to convert to Christianity. Now, it's hard for us to imagine why, but that's because we're living 4 centuries later, 3 centuries later, and it's difficult to crawl into the minds and the society of the time. Suffice it to say that in the century after Mendelssohn, tens of thousands of German Jews converted willingly. And in the 19th century, between Austria and Germany, 250,000 Jews converted. So that Austria and Germany are full of Jewish blood. Which, only God can sort these things out. And the belief was, and Mendelssohn, as I mentioned, 4 of his 6 children converted. The belief was that if you want to be German, then you have to adopt a majority religion. You cannot be different. And since it's all enlightenment, it's all a matter of reason, and so there's no difference between religions. What difference does it make? So Friedlander, who later was one of the heads of Reform Judaism and who was Mendelssohn's student, Friedlander came up with a great idea. There was going to be one religion, and that the church should not require baptism. The Jews would give up all their ritual. There would be one religion, and everybody would live happily ever after. This idea, he called them unwashed Jews, because they wouldn't be baptized. This idea gained great credence amongst the Jews. The Christians were horrified. There was a famous Christian professor, Teller, who was very close to Friedlander, and they wrote to each other and discussed with each other, and Friedlander felt certain that Teller would jump on the bandwagon. Teller wrote him the most sharply written letter, saying that, how dare you? And that if you had any true feelings for Germany and true feelings for reason, etc., you should convert to Christianity. And you shouldn't dare say that somehow there's going to be one universal religion. But you hear that, you hear echoes of that in the Jewish world today. Mendelssohn is the one that laid the foundation for it. Mendelssohn said the main thing in life is to be a mensch. What the Haskalah said later, that it's to be a Jew in your home and to be like everybody else in the street. So he said the main thing was to be a mensch. And a mensch is a universal thing. It's not restricted to any religion. Anybody should be a mensch. I was quote here what the late singer Karlbach used to say, that if he went on campus and performed the concert, and then a student came over to him and said, you know, well, I'm a Roman Catholic. He said, well, the student was a Roman Catholic. The student said he was a Protestant, and he was a Protestant. He said he was a Muslim, he's a Muslim. If someone came over and said, I'm a human being, that's a Jew. The Jew is the mensch. And they sincerely believed that being a mensch would be enough. It hasn't proven that way. It didn't turn out that way at all. But now when you had these mass conversions, so you had the same problem that happened with the mass conversions of Jews in Spain, is that the old Christians refused to accept the new Christians. And they said they're hypocrites. They're doing it for money. They're doing it to get ahead. They're doing it for marriage. And the Baron Rothschild, when he came to Germany to found the bank, so he was offered in marriage the hand of one of the wealthiest German bankers, a non-Jew, and he refused to intermarry, let alone convert. And he said, the Rothschilds are Jews. We have made our fortune being Jews, and I will remain a Jew. I have no intention of changing. But he was exceptional. We find Jews that converted and became counts and barons, noblemen. Some became generals in the army. It was the way to get in. And the Jews took it. So you have to look at reform as attempting to create a situation where Jews could have all the benefits without having to convert. Reform came to stem the tide of conversion, so to speak. So they said, we'll make you as good a German, but you don't have to convert. And we'll take Judaism, we'll take all the ritual out of it. Saturday will become Sunday. You'll be just like your German neighbor. The temple will resemble the church. We'll put an organ in it. We'll do everything, right? But you don't have to convert. And the truth is that German reform shot its bolt. It ran by the end of the 19th century. It had run its course in Germany simply because of the fact that it had no grandchildren. And what saved reform was the fact that it transplanted itself to the United States, and it took root in the United States, where also the original reform have no grandchildren. But reform today consists mainly of descendants of Orthodox Jews and of intermarried couples. So this is what Friedland thought. There was a Jew by the name of Solomon Maimon, Shlomo Maimon, who was born in Lithuania, who was also a Talmudic genius. Something snapped in him. He deserted his wife, his family. He writes, I left my wife, my family, my faith, everything. And he became a bohemian, a rogue, a womanizer. But he was still a genius. And he comes to Berlin, and his writings become popular. He was also asked to become Christian, And he refused. He refused because he said, I did not leave the faith of Moses to adopt a secondary faith, which naturally endeared him to everyone. But these are the types of people that now made Berlin the most attractive city in Europe for young Jews who were looking to get out into the world, were looking to escape, so to speak, the Jewish milieu, who were looking to make for themselves a name in the world and to advance. And Berlin remained that way until Hitler's time. So that even great students of the yeshiva and great Rosh Yeshiva in the 20th century went to Berlin for Bildung, because that's what was accepted, and it was seen as the stepping stone for Jewish leadership and Jewish greatness. The Jewish community in Germany and Berlin grew in spite of all the restrictions. Eventually it was 6% of the population, but the 6% made noise like it was 60%. And Jews rapidly became very noticeable. They were the media, the newspapers, they were the department stores, the merchants, they were in banking. Later in the 20th century, they would even come into the government. And from the outside, at least, it looked like the Jews in Germany were in the best position of all of the Jews in Europe. But the reckoning was that they were never accepted. Never. No matter what they did. And they were unaware of that. Completely unaware of that. The Jews many times prefer to close their eyes than to face reality. We prefer to be optimistic even though there are no grounds for such optimism. We say that there are great windows of opportunity and blessings, and in reality none exist. It could be that we have to be that way, because otherwise if we were pessimistic and always realistic, we would not have survived. So we have to be what Shalom Aleichem called Luftmenschen. People who live in the air, people who live in a fantasy world, in a dream world. That's what German Jewry was a dream world. It was a world of culture, and we'll see that reflected in the Orthodox world a century after Mendelssohn by Samson Raphael Hirsch and the Jewish community in Frankfurt am Main. Now that community was what Mendelssohn wanted it to be for Germany. It was a community of Orthodox, observant Jews who were German to the core, who had university education, who had Bildung, who went to the opera, who were exactly like their German neighbors, except that they were observant, which is a big except. But it's ironic, I think that's the only word for it, it's ironic that Hirsch is the one that fulfilled the Mendelssohnian ideal, whereas Mendelssohn and his group ended up being Christians, ended up going away completely. Mendelssohn went east into Lithuania and Poland and Galicia. The Haskalah is built upon Mendelssohnian ideas. It's built upon the same idea that if there's a Jewish culture, that's sufficient. You hear it today here in Israel, culture, culture, culture. They don't give enough money for culture. Like that's the problem here. There's no culture, and there's not enough money for culture. But what's culture? They bemoan the fact that the American culture is taken over. It's not American culture. It's, you know, it's all the nonsense. But you hear that echo over and over again. That's 18th century Germany. And the same thing, education. And I'm all for education, don't get me wrong. But having a college degree does not solve world problems. Many times it complicates it. And the ironic point, again, is that 1/3 of all the commandants of the Nazi death camps possessed either a PhD or an MD. So Bildung is not the end. Doesn't do it. And all the reasonableness in the world doesn't stop the gas chamber from operating. And this export of ideas of reason and culture, above all else, undermined the Jewish community in Eastern Europe as well. It's interesting, you have the schools were called Tarbut schools, culture schools. That was the name that they gave it. And Mendelssohn was the hero. Of course, what happened to Mendelssohn's family really put a damper on the entire thing. Goethe said that music could not be produced by a Jew because it requires a different kind of soul. So when they said Felix Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn's grandson, became a great composer of classical music, it played until today. So they said, but he converted. He was a loyal, devout Christian. In fact, no one wrote more music for the church than Mendelssohn wrote. So you have this absolute mishmash, mixture, which so influenced German Jewry and later Eastern European Jewry, and even our times. It's all of its echoes are still here, and now it's all complicated by the fact that the Holocaust occurred through German auspices. It's complicated by all of these factors. So it's hard to see what the gain was, so to speak. But these are the facts of what happened, and this is what changed the face of Jewry over the last 2 centuries. And basically, it all stemmed from Berlin, from the ideas of the Enlightenment, and from the creation of Moses Mendelssohn as its hero, and the fact that it was very seductive to the Jewish world, and it brought about, unfortunately, great problems and great disasters. Next week, we're going to talk about Vilna, the Haskalah in Lithuania. Again, thank you for coming tonight.